So, welcome everyone, and I'm proud to thank Thomas Szanto, who is today our guest, for being here, having an opportunity to hear some of his ideas. We held today lecture, Political Resentment from Reevaluation to False Solidarity, and tomorrow seminar and discussion about the question, can hatred ever be appropriate? I will shortly introduce our today's guest. Thomas Szanto is currently senior researcher at in philosophy at the University of Jyväskylä and visiting professor at the Center for the Subjectivity Research at the University of Copenhagen, and soon he'll be associate professor at the University of Copenhagen. He finished his studies and earned a PhD at the University of Vienna in 2010. In that time, he was also visiting student at the University of Paris 8. By that time, he mostly worked on Husserl phenomenology, trying to make a connection between contemporary analytic philosophy of mind and its language analysis approach, including cognitive sciences with phenomenological approach. One of the outputs of this work is certainly the monograph published by the Gruyter in 2012, Bewusstsein, Intentionalität und mentale Repräsentation, Husserl und die analytische Philosophie des Geistes, or Consciousness, Intentionality and Mental Representation, Husserl and the Analytical Philosophy of Mind. Szanto taught at many European universities, including University of Graz, Klagenfurt, Dublin, and also taken part in the big interdisciplinary project of active societies at Freie Universität in Berlin. His work is generally focused on philosophy of emotion and social ontology, investigating the question of collective emotions, and to critically analyze the questions such as if it is and how possible to ascribe emotion to a group agent, how the communities are constituted specifically regarding its robust cultural and normative patterns of emotions, what different kinds of social emotion we could address, for example, differences between shared and collective emotions, so on, and what kind of normativity is involved in or implied by collective emotions. He was the co-editor of the volume The Phenomenology of Sociality, Discovering the Way, published by Routledge in 2015, and the forthcoming Routledge edition, The Handbook of Philosophy of Emotion, which came in 2012. Szanto's work is also characterized by readiness to tackle relevant social and political issues, and in that sense we could say that his theory is really socially engaged, some way, and something that unfortunately cannot be said for many philosophical analyses, and some way specifically and paradoxically also in social ontology. And this especially applies for his most recent project about antagonistic political emotions. Specifically, I would say, which is mostly focused on way how the political antagonistic emotion are collectivized and how they're collectivizing its target. And the two events we will have today and tomorrow are in some way part of this project. So without further ado, the word to
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Igor. This was the longest and most elaborate introduction I ever received. I'm really honored by that. Thanks a lot, and thanks for the invitation, and thanks for you for coming at this late hour of the day. I know from Igor that you have a lot of seminars and events here. I'm working at a similar center as here, and I really appreciate it for everybody taking the time to yet another talk on a nasty emotion, as it were, or sentiment, or affective mechanism, as you will see. So today, as Igor mentioned already, so today's talk and the talk or the seminar that we have tomorrow are, I think, quite fitting together, also not just because they are both antagonistic emotions, and because I highlight in both talks, or in the paper and in this paper, the collaborative and somewhat, in some sense, collective context or social context of these antagonistic sentiments, but also, as you will probably see, also the kind of the structure analysis that I suggest is partly overlapping. And both of these talks and the issues on ressentiment and on hatred are part of the project that Igor mentioned, that he, hopefully we will get the funding, and then Igor will also be a part of, and other colleagues, Peter also will be hopefully, if we get the funding, part of that project on antagonistic political emotions. So much for the background. So I entitled this talk "Politics of Ressentiment," but a caveat to the title. So I will not really go into the details of the political details of this talk. But this is kind of the basis that I want to, the basic analysis of ressentiment as a politically relevant and as a political emotion. But why I still called it politics of ressentiment is because precisely, as I already mentioned, I want to highlight especially in the last section of the talk, the collaborative and social and in some sense collective context in which this sentiment and affective mechanism plays out. Here is the outline of, and I'm sorry for this mess with the slides. I hope you can still kind of decipher, but let me know if I need to elaborate something that you can't see, but most of it should be still visible. So this is the outlook. The first part will be kind of an initial sketch of what ressentiment is, also distinguishing it from resentment a little bit, and then I will zoom in more detail, and it will be a little bit more also technical, I hope not too much, and you can interrupt me anytime, by the way, so if you have questions. On the effective intentional structure and the mechanisms of overgeneralizing the target that some of you might have already encountered from the hatred paper for tomorrow. And then I will especially focus in the second part on what might be construed and interpreted, and I will do that also relying partly on Scheler, partly on other literature. Ressentiment is a certain form of intentional self-deception, or a certain kind of self-deception that Scheler calls illusion of value feeling. And then in the last part, I want to elaborate this, what I call the negative dialectics, or this false solidarity structure of collaboratively engaging in these self-deceptive mechanisms. Okay, so let's come to the first part, so really the initial sketch. So one thing I think that is important to mention, and that is sometimes mentioned, and Scheler was probably the first to have really as clearly put it as this, but it is often not really emphasized, and I think it should be, namely a kind of really sociological prerequisite for this ressentiment to arise in the first place. And this is very bluntly put, the need, or what is required here, is a formally equal society that is only formally equal, though, and where there might be, and typically are, blatant socioeconomic, cultural, whatever other differences. But formally, so the society pertains to be an equal, egalitarian society. So ressentiment, and this is something that Scheler is very clear on, will, for example, not arise in that sense in a feudal society or in a caste society. I hope it will become clear why this is not the case. Very initially and roughly still, sources, what are the sources, triggers and dynamics, and I will go in more detail on all of this just to kind of generate what the phenomenon, a sense for the phenomenon here. So the source is a sense, and it mustn't be justified, but there must be some kind of feeling or sense on behalf of the subject of ressentiment of a loss of equal footing is the target of ressentiment. So this is either manifest in a feeling of impotence for certain reactive or retaliatory measures that would react to alleged or real harms to the subject of ressentiment from the target, or impotence to achieve certain positive values that the subject construes as positive values. We will see, for example, success, as we will see. and this is often goes hand in hand, certain feelings of inferiority towards those who bear those those positive values that are unattainable for the subject of ressentiment. So think again, for just as a toy example, success is unattainable for me and I have a feeling of inferiority. The trigger, this is kind of the source, but what really triggers this mechanism to kick in is are certain initial stage emotions. So we have certain kind of self-relevant or self-regarding emotions, like, and these are the typical ones. It's not just any examples, envy, shame, or maybe feelings of revenge, but envy and shame are really important here, which disclose to me as the subject of ressentiment those positive values that are at stake, success, for example, of the other. I'm envying the other's big house or car or whatever. But that wouldn't in itself trigger the mechanism of ressentiment to kick in. The problem is that I'm, for whatever reasons, because I'm inferior, or because I don't have the power, or because it is socially not legitimate, I'm not able to discharge, as it were, or express those emotions and act on them, on envy, on shame, on feelings of revenge. I will not take revenge or go around and tell everybody that I'm envious. So there is a repression, as you will see, of these initial stage emotions. And the result, so an important point about this is that we have initial stage emotions that are not ressentiment in itself, envy, shame, typically, and then the effective mechanism that is, as you will see, ressentiment transforms those emotions, envy and shame, into further final stage, if you will, emotions, which are hostile and which will be, which are what I would call, I mean, this is a term that I kind of use for lack of something better, crypto-reactive attitude. So these contempt, blame, resentment, schadenfreude, indignation, malice not, but hatred would be, and hatred is a special case, as you will say, but think really of resentment, contempt, blame as typical so-called reactive attitudes. So these are moral emotions, they are directed, they are targeting others and want to express also moral breaches, as you will see in a moment, resentment, to testify to harms that I have suffered or somebody else that is dear to me has suffered. And these are the resulting hostile emotions of the process of ressentiment, but they are not to be confused with them. All of what I've said should hopefully become clearer throughout the paper. This is really the initial picture. Now, very important is to distinguish ressentiment in this technical sense, that in the technical sense was introduced probably as the first by Nietzsche. It was used before Nietzsche by Kierkegaard also and by others. It originates from French philosophy also. But in this sense that we are talking here today, it was Nietzsche the first to introduce it, and then I think the most systematic modern conception that I'm also using mostly is by Scheler. And till today, especially in the Anglo-Saxon literature, I'm not saying that it is always conflated, it's not, but often it is. Sometimes there are arguments, more or less good ones, to really not conflate but identify resentment and ressentiment. But I think it is very important still to keep them at least initially apart, and I think they are very different in the end, as you will see. So unlike ressentiment, resentment, as it is used very prominently, for example, by B.F. Strawson, but also Rawls uses it, and many other authors. I mean, Adam Smith uses it also already in quite a technical sense, which is conducive also to contemporary literature somewhat. But resentment is an often, not necessarily, but often justified angry reaction, moral outrage towards political, moral injustices that I have suffered, or that somebody that is important to me has suffered, and they do have as such, often, not necessarily, but often a legitimate normative, moral, social, political function. They are not just, as ressentiment is, at least initially, just an expression of helpless and helpless frustration, but precisely they mark moral and normative breaches. So they are also meant to by expressing resentment towards somebody, I also intend not just to mark for myself or for this specific other, the perpetrator, normative breaches, but also towards third parties. And this is one kind of elaborated here. So resentment often aims precisely at eliciting others' third parties' reaction on my own behalf or on the behalf of those whom I care about, in order for restoring shared norms or for retributive justice, etc. And it often is discussed precisely in discussions on political philosophy of retributive justice. Also after, for example, genocides, resentment as being having this important function. And some also allude to the fact that because of all these functions, which are just variations of the same, resentment expresses and is important actually to generate a sense of justice, both individually and also in society. Now, this is exactly not the case. None of what I've said about resentment is not working for ressentiment. It is not geared at correcting or alleviating wrongdoing, so exactly the opposite of resentment, but only at best at registering and voicing towards, typically voicing not so much towards third parties, but towards myself and my in-group, as you will see, felt injuries. So, this is the authors who mark quite clearly this distinction between ressentiment and resentment are, for example, these authors from contemporary literature. Now, this is very concretely about the political aspects, but it's very brief, as you can see. But this is something that I find extremely interesting, and where there has been quite a bit of work. But especially interesting, I think, is the work of Mikko Salminen and Christian Concheve on the intimate link, and they kind of review, so if you're interested in this, I can give you the detailed references to this paper. They review all this literature, specifically on social movements, on political movements, on right and left-wing populism, and they show that there seems to be and it's very plausible that there is an intimate link between ressentiment and right-wing populism. They argue, I think, really very convincingly, that resentment, as opposed to ressentiment, is the typical emotion that is manifest and that is important for left-wing populism. So indignation movements, Occupy Wall Street, that's what I mean by left-wing. Maybe populism is not the right term, but also left-wing social movements or also populist parties. Resentment, whereas ressentiment is the typical right-wing effective mechanism exploited here. Okay, now a little bit more, we are getting more kind of into the details. So I've already spoke about resentment, ressentiment as an emotion even. I don't think it's an emotion, so that was just to use a short term. But I think it is very important, again, and this is something that is very little done in the literature, to be very clear about what exactly is ressentiment when it comes to typology or a taxonomy with regard to different types of affective phenomena. So think of things like moods, character traits, sentiments, emotions, etc. And it's not quite easy to characterize or to put ressentiment into any of these categories. I think we need, I think that's the most adequate description is, if you will, multi-componential. So it is a sentiment, it's also in some sense a trait. I wouldn't say a character trait, but a trait, as you will see. And that's the most important aspect that I want to then elaborate. It's an effective mechanism. But as a sentiment, it's multi-tracking. So multi-tracking means here that it's a sentiment that targets different formal, or that is directed at different formal objects. And I will say more about that, what that means. Because different emotions are involved in that. That is meant by multi-tracking, but that's maybe not so important. Sentiment here means that it's a robust, fairly robust, diachronically also robust disposition to experience and also to enact a series of hostile emotions, and these are dynamically ordered. So we have initial stage ones, and we shame, and then hostile emotions like contempt, indignation, etc. So it's robust, and it's also a complex disposition or a complex sentiment. Complex in the sense that contempt, malice, resentment, hatred, shame, schadenfreude, etc. will all play into that, and those track different kind of features. But this is the most important part, and this is also the most complex kind of aspect of ressentiment. And this is not often used, this term. I'm not even sure anybody kind of really talks, maybe Salmela does, at some point, about ressentiment as a mechanism, as an effective mechanism. What do I mean by this? It's a mechanism that has three components, or there are three mechanisms at play here. That's why I say it's complex. That all are necessary for this, for ressentiment to work and to be effective, and to characterize also what's going on here. One mechanism is, and I already alluded to it at least, is a repression or suppression of the expression and also the acknowledgement, as you will see in a self-deceptive move, of the triggering emotion. So think back, it's envy, shame typically. They are repressed in the sense that their expression, their enactment, and also their acknowledgement by the very subject of this emotion are repressed. Then, just as important is that there is a re-evaluation going on, and I will also go into more detail about that. Re-evaluation of the unattainable positive values, and by values here I mean something like evaluative properties that I evaluate positively, like for example success, if I do, let's assume, into these values. So there is a re-evaluation. This is something that is very prominent in Nietzsche. I mean, this is I think of this transformation of the order of rankings of values, etc., and Scheler, of course, also. And then hand in hand with this goes a transmutation, for the lack of a better term, so a kind of a mutation or transformation of the triggering self-regarding emotions and we shame into other ones. So this is kind of a semi-repetition, just to make it clear that we should distinguish these different mechanisms, but they are all important, all necessary, and they all are, of course, going hand in hand at the same time, but it's still, I think, as mechanisms structurally different. But also, and I'm hesitant to call ressentiment a character trait. I mean, Nietzsche, for example, and also Scheler sometimes, not so prominently, but Nietzsche, as you I guess know, speaks of the man of ressentiment. The priests would be the typical for Nietzsche, and the early Christianity would be typical exponents of man of ressentiment. And you could say that it's kind of, for Nietzsche, maybe not a character trait, but a first trait of certain types of social types. But I do think that what is important, that it can become also and sediment itself as a trait that is partly defining, not only, but partly defining really groups. And certain, what might be called with some sociologists of emotion, call it emotional cultures or emotional habits. Is a term, for example, used by Eva Illus, who is a really interesting sociologist working mainly on emotions, and she coined these terms, emotional culture. Not for ressentiment, but many speak quite loosely, they don't usually define it, but of cultures of ressentiment. So, for example, in between war Germany is often characterized as fascist Germany or Nazi Germany in between the wars. Still, for example, as this culture of ressentiment. This is also what I mean partly here, that it can become at least a trait of a group. Okay, now to move ahead. This was kind of really the initial picture. Now, what I want to focus in the next two parts is unresolved so far for us, unresolved and partly also in the literature. I think at least the second aspect not really elaborated. The first is why actually is ressentiment. This takes up a question that I'm also interested in with regard to hatred tomorrow. Why is ressentiment structurally inappropriate sentiment and mechanism? So what's wrong, as it were, with ressentiment in that sense? And the answer will be, and this is something analyzed by Scheler especially and others, that it is a self-deceptive presentation of values, and what Scheler calls the illusion of value feeling. So there is an illusion going on, a self-deceptive illusion. And then the second question is, why is it actually wrong to bear this sentiment, ressentiment, structurally, morally, but also psychodynamically, as we will see, and the answer here will be because this self-deceptive mechanism is spiraling and reinforcing itself in the collaborative context. Okay, so before we get there, we have to get a little bit more detail to understand also really how the self-deception really goes about, the effective intentional structure of ressentiment. This is maybe a little bit formal, but I try to be clear, and we can discuss outstanding issues also in the discussion if it should be unclear. So it has been customary, I'm sure many of you know, or all of you know, I don't know, in the contemporary literature on emotions in general, to distinguish two at least intentional aspects of emotions, and I think it is important to distinguish a third one, and then it helps suggest that. So the one is the intentional object, or the intentional simply target of the emotions, then the formal object, and then what is called sometimes the focus. So the object, in that sense of really what does this emotion targets, and what is also targeting, also in the sense that who or what is it that triggered this emotion. And this is, I think, pretty straightforward. So these are groups of people or specific persons But they are, as in the case of hatred, I think this is very similar in the two sentiments, that it is typically an unspecified other kind of capital letter written other or others, and very loose kind of properties or features they exhibit, their ways of life, their ways of being, their habitus, their success just globally without specifying it. So for just to put it in one kind of a couple of examples, it would be then de-establishment, or the way de-establishment is, without really specifying what the problem exactly with the establishment is, or de-refugees, or this kind of capitalized others, as it were. And Scheler has a nice capture for this when he says that the intentionality of Ressentiment, as he puts it, it's pretty much untranslatable. It's also a neologism in German. He speaks of Irradiierung of the rays of intentionality in all kinds of directions. So that more or less means that kind of it radiates into all kinds of diffuse directions and actually doesn't really have a direction, the intentionality, or at least not a specific one. But I think it's a nice kind of metaphor for this blurry, overgeneralized target. But way more interesting is what the formal object. The formal object is the object of emotions. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this technical term, introduced first by Kenny in the 60s and then taken up by many people in philosophy of emotions. The formal object is, on the one hand, what individuates specific emotions as those emotions as they are. What does that mean? So think the formal object of fear, and this is a typical example often brought, is the dangerousness. So the formal object of fear of a dog, or fear, my fearing of a dangerous looking dog, is not the dog is the target, but the formal object is the dangerousness for me, as it were, of the dog. Or the dangerousness of the, or frighteningness, some would say, is the formal object of fear. Now what is and this individuates the emotion fear as opposed, for example, to anger, because dangerousness is not the formal object of anger. Whatever anger it is, it's something that has been a wrong done to me that elicits my anger, for example. But so what is this formal object in the case of Ressentiment? And I want to argue that it doesn't have any specific formal objects, unsurprisingly, I think, by now, but it inherits, as it were, a whole range of formal objects from the specific emotions that are building up this complex sentiment and affective mechanism. So envy, inferiority, the wrong worthy of contempt would be part of the formal object. The inferiority or disvalue that I feel because of unattained values, that would be shown in envy to me. But very different things. Now the question is, and so what it is not certainly is the formal object of Ressentiment is not, as it is precisely in Ressentiment, an injustice that has been done to me, or harmful effects of something that the other has done. Now the question is, and this is I think really crucial, and this I know only of one single author, a great, a really wonderful, the best, I think, ever piece written on Ressentiment, a recently published PhD thesis, not published yet, but soon to be published PhD thesis by a Swiss guy. It is available online, so I can give you the references. It's publicly available very easily online. It's a whole book basically on Ressentiment, and he is the only one who really answers the question, then what unites, what is then the formal object, or if there is no formal object, what makes Ressentiment a unitary affective phenomenon at all? If there is the target is diffuse, overgeneralized, and there is no formal object, then you might wonder, okay, then Ressentiment is really not a distinctive sentiment at all. It is not individuated. It might be something like an affective model or of different kind of antagonistic emotions, but is it then right to speak about it as a unitary or as a distinct affective phenomenon? I think it is, because it has a specific focus that unites it, and this is something that is suggested. I mean, I'm building on it by Eschbach in this PhD. He interprets it a bit differently as of the formal object. I think it is rather the focus. But the idea is this. So what unites, what makes also the phenomenology, if you will, of Ressentiment distinctive is its focus, and its focus is a herd self-esteem. But what is this focus? This is the third component that I've mentioned, so target, formal object, and focus. What the focus is, I mean, this is a very complex notion introduced especially by Bennett Helm in a series of papers and books. But briefly put, the focus is what makes the target matter to me. So not just what it is, it's the dangerousness of the dog, but why does dangerousness of the dog in a specific situation matter to me? And this is a very stupid or very primitive example. There it's basically the focus and the formal object in this case more or less coincides. But in more complex cases, it doesn't coincide, simply because it's kind of what the focus shows me. The focus of my emotion or sentiments makes it intelligible to other people also. How the target, actually this other person, is related to, in this specific situation, to the formal object. And in the case of Ressentiment, this is what Eschbach argues a little bit differently, but more or less the idea is from him, is herd self-esteem. And this is manifest in feelings of inferiority and unattainable values. So what this herd self-esteem shows is, or how it's manifested, is then it's so that what this herd self-esteem also has as a formal object such itself is the unattainable values that are of import to me because they are important for my self-conception. This is important. So if success is not anything that plays any role for my self-conception, if it is not really self-relevant value, then it won't be the focus of anything, and then it won't hurt my self-esteem that I'm not a successful, say in terms of monetary success or financial success or whatever, so academic success or whatever. Now, an interesting, actually the first who has hinted at exactly an analysis like this is not this PhD that I mentioned, but Else Voigtländer. It's a very little known, great phenomenologist of emotion. It's published only in this original publication from 1910, but it's available also online, so it's freely available. It was a dissertation of her on, so before Scheler, if you so notice that this is years before Scheler analysis. And the book is on so-called feelings of self-worth, Selbstgefühle in German. It's not translated. And there she has a brief but really interesting analysis of Ressentiment, building a little bit on Nietzsche, but going beyond that. and saying that ressentiment is actually a conscious mechanism, a deliberate and conscious mechanism to restore injured, pre-reflective, what she calls vital feelings of self-worth. So in a way, it's this analysis in some sense, in a nutshell at least. So Ressentiment tries to restore consciously, deliberately injured self-esteem, if you will, which is not, which is pre-reflective, pre-reflectively acknowledged only. Now, I mean, this is not crucial. It will be a little bit important for. So this is the guy I mentioned, is Eschbach, and then Ingrid Wenderer-Farran, a colleague, has a nice paper on Voigtländer forthcoming, where she also goes into this analysis. What is not crucial but will play some role, at least in the last part of the talk soon, is distinction between self-esteem and self-respect. So usually, and I haven't really worked on this distinction myself so much, but usually self-esteem is distinguished as a function of one's own self-evaluation in realizing or attaining or having or bearing self-relevant values or features, whereas self-respect is usually characterized as a social function. So I have self-respect if the community that I'm a member of and that I care about evaluates my own social standing accordingly, and also my moral standing accordingly. And self-esteem is the focus of ressentiment, and self-respect typically of resentment, the focus of resentment, hurt, self-respect, but as we will see in the collaborative context, self-respect will also play a role. Now, how does this, so we have now the intentional structure and the focus of the emotion, and how now does the mechanism of self-deception work, before we get to the collaborative part, which will be then short. So this, now I'm coming to basically this repression mechanism and the reevaluation mechanism interpreted as a form of intentional self-deception. And this builds a lot on Scheler as, again, this analysis. So Scheler calls ressentiment an illusion of value feeling. And what does that mean? So what happens here is that in this repression mechanism, the positive but unattainable values are discredited, as he says. So verleumden, it's fairly difficult to translate, but I think best is discredited in front of, kind of in front of myself, but also others potentially. And the objects and what this discrediting means are either, there are two ways of doing it. Often they are both used, or might only be one. This distinction is from Eschbach between weak and strong ressentiment. So weak ressentiment would be if the object, the object is re-evaluated as undesirable. So I re-evaluate the values that I cannot attain. So think of Aesop's fable, the famous fable with the sour grapes, the fox that can't reach the sour grapes. That's the typical case of it's often used as an example, as a basic example of ressentiment structure at least. So either what happens in this weak form is that the grapes are re-evaluated as sour and as not desirable in that sense, but there's a stronger form which is actually also more effective in the longer run, that the person of ressentiment, the subject of ressentiment, reverses its own or the whole social value ranking as such. So one interprets actually the sweetness not as simply sour, but sweetness is actually something that is not desirable. This is what Scheele and also Nietzsche would call reversing of value ranking. So, and importantly, and I will go in a little bit more detail about that, the unattainable, so those unattainable values, sweetness, say for example, are, and this is very important, this is quotes from Scheele, are still felt as those values that they are, or those the desires are still targeting the sweetness, and they are felt. But they are, as Scheele puts it, overcast, so these feelings are overcast by false values. Now, importantly, and this is a distinct, I don't want to go into the detail, and I can't really go into the details, but the basic assumption here from Scheele and many other early phenomenologists is that there's a distinction between value feelings, which is a technical term, Wertfühlen, Wertnehmen, and simply feelings, so feelings and value feelings. And what Scheele does not want to say, and what would be wrong to say, I think also, is that the feelings themselves are somehow illusory. The Ressentiment person simply doesn't feel what he or she pertains and vows to feel. That's not the point. The value feeling is illusory. It's an illusion of value feeling, and value feelings are those aspects, and that's a very complicated discussion what actually value feelings are. But I think the best way to understand it is that you might disclose a value, sweetness, for example, and you do that by, for example, a desire or an emotion or an aesthetic. Think of an aesthetic of an aesthetic value, but you do not accordingly necessarily feel the emotion. So you do realize, in this value feeling that this landscape or this painting is pleasant or beautiful. You appreciate it in that sense through this value feeling that discloses you the beauty of this landscape, but you are untouched by it. You don't feel that value in that sense. Not as a value feeling, but as a feeling. And so the point is that it's not the feelings that are illusory, the feelings are still there. And it's also not the case, and these are kind of negative characterizations of what this illusion of value feeling is not. It's not simply a complete erasing of the positive. So repression doesn't mean here that I completely erase and forget and don't care about the positive values, or I'm not aware of their allure, as it were. And it's also not simply a cognitive dissonance, as it were. So it's not simply, as Scheele says, a feeling of unattainable values, and then simply I feel that I want the sweet and I feel hurt by not having the success, but then I simply form a judgment which tells me don't care about success. It's more complex than that. It's really a self-deceptive mechanism. It's a complex conflict or tension between beliefs, value feelings, and the according feelings that I still have. And it's also, and this is I think clear, it's not simply hypocrisy. It's not simply that I tell other people I don't care about success. It concerns myself in the first instance at least, and then also others. So ultimately, Ressentiment is a self-deception and this is something that again Eschbach points out and parallels this discussion of intentional self-deception, focusing on Nietzsche mostly. But ultimately, so Ressentiment as a self-deception, the problem with it is that there is a lack of self-elaboration, a deficient self-elaboration of what I really care about. So there is a deficiency in the relation of my own emotions to the values that actually those emotions disclose as value feelings. Now, don't get confused by this. This looks complicated. It's not at all complicated. It's just really a summary of what I said. It's just give you, once again, to conclude this individual analysis, You don't even have to read it. Just to give you this very recap, basically, as an example. So the basic example: somebody X and Y are two persons, say envies the success of somebody else. This person X is ashamed of her lack of success and her envy, may be ashamed also of her envying, because envy is an emotion that you shouldn't have in many societies. This is associated at the same time with feelings of powerlessness to attain success, with inferiority complex, frustration, and damaged self-esteem that is kind of at stake here. Then the process kicks in that this person represses envy and shame, and maybe also other emotions like fear about losing one's status, and starts, so this ressentiment mechanism starts to kick in towards this other person. And facilitated now by this whole repression mechanism, the person presents in a self-deceptive way the other's values or success as actually something that is undesirable or even maybe reprehensible. So for example, tries to convince herself and succeeds in some sense, on some level, to convince herself, but not simply by forming a judgment, but by this complex process of reevaluation, that success only corrupts, and success is only based on greediness, etc., whatever it might be. And this means that this person has an illusory value feeling. And then the result is that the ensuing sentiments or emotions like resentment, contempt, I bear contempt towards the other because I have convinced myself that this other is greedy or is a corrupt person or has stolen from the state or whatever. But importantly, I'm still acknowledging the positive values, and I'm still feeling that actually I want success myself. Otherwise it would be pointless and not self-deceptive. So much, and now the brief, bear with me just for max 10 minutes, probably shorter. I'm soon finished. But this is, I think, maybe the most interesting part is also a little bit still sketchy in my analysis. But this is the direction I want to pursue also with this whole project on Ressentiment. And I have worked on aspects of this, what I'm presenting it with regard to partly hatred in the paper of tomorrow, but also more generally on what I've called collaborative self-deception and the role of emotions there in another paper, not related to Ressentiment. But this is kind of what I want to build on for the analysis of Ressentiment, because I think this is really crucially at play in Ressentiment. So just as a one background note, I want to argue, I would want to argue, I don't do it here, but this is the background argument, that Ressentiment actually would never occur in a social void and without collaborative reinforcement. I don't want to say that it's necessarily a collective phenomenon, that it can only be initiated, so I can individually bear Ressentiment towards also another individual. But I wouldn't do that if there wouldn't be all kinds of social mechanisms that reinforce that, and especially those values that are at stake are of social relevance also for my social identity, and not just for my personal kind of preference. But that's kind of just the background. Now, I think the analysis I want to suggest here is that there is a collaborative self-deception going on here. And there is a bottom-up and a top-down process going on. Bottom-up means here simply from individuals or from the individual and interpersonal level, up to the group level tendencies, and then group level tendencies to the individual. So bottom up, and I will say 1-2 slides more about what I mean here, is that individuals' respective self-deceptions that I've just mentioned and repressions facilitate and mutually reinforce the others in a certain group context, a collaborative context. And this leads to group level tendencies. And then viewed from the group level tendencies, and this is kind of a spiraling, that's why I call it spiraling, so it's not one first and then the other, this is kind of a reinforcement situation. From the group level, or viewed from the group level and from reinforced, for example, and these are really just examples and one would have to look at that, but typically by media, by blogs, in context of demonstrations or talks at restaurants or whatever, heated political discussions. That's what I mean here by group level reinforcement. That mustn't be very complicated, but can be very complicated also and exploited. But these corroborate the individual self-deception. And hence there is a form of social stabilization of my own or of individuals' own self-deceptive tendencies by what social psychologists call social reappraisal. And this leads precisely to this what I call collaborative spiraling of self-deception and group level illusion of value feelings. Just a side note, so what is here, I'm not sure whether you can read that, but group level, I want to be here a little bit cautious. I do think there are collective emotions. Definitely I would argue that you can make a case for collective emotions, but here I don't want to defend or also analyze collective ressentiment. Group level here means simply it mustn't be instantiated together as a feeling. So again, if you think of the distinction between value feeling and feelings, it mustn't be felt together, but the value feelings with the same focus, etc., must be shared or at least collaborative in this case. But that's just a side note. So just to closing sides on what I just said. So what is happening here actually? And I think there are kind of 3 aspects of this collaborative spiral. So on the one hand, what happens, there is a reevaluation that we have also in the individual level, but which is legitimized and gains further currency and objectivity, false in a way objectivity, but alleged objectivity on the group level. So instead, me bearing alone negative, frustrating, and probably also, typically also frowned upon emotions like shame and envy, which are not good to have, either not good to have as it were, or you shouldn't have that in typical social cultural settings, so you shouldn't be envious. And instead of doing that, and also instead of, and in order to kind of not simply be forced to struggle with myself alone, being irrational, practically irrational, self-deceptive, and lose further my self-esteem as a rational agent and also a rational kind of emoter, what I need is setting up seemingly objective moral values. So seemingly objective, or at least semi-objective, namely objective in a certain kind of group context. And by doing that, I am facilitated in group context by groups cross-testifying and reinforcing these self-deceptive tendencies. So they will agree to me, yes, success only corrupts, the establishment is only stealing money, etc., etc. Even though potentially all the individuals kind of reinforcing and cross-testifying itself, all of them, let's assume, are just envious of the success. And hence, what I also gain by all this process is a certain form of group recognition. So my kind of false or self-deceptive values that I have re-evaluated and set up are recognized as actually right ones by the group. A second and related, and these are all mechanisms that go hand in hand, I would say, and one would have to be maybe clearer to distinguish them, but I think these are the crucial elements. So instead again of doom to failure identification or kind of trying to identify or build into my social identity the positive values that I cannot attain, success, that is exemplified by an outgroup or by another person, I can re-establish my old, new, as it were, identity along my own in-group, along the values of my own in-group, which are set against and instead of the actually desirable ones. And what happens here, and this is the last last mechanism, and this is why I call it false solidarity. So what I mean by negative and false solidarity, these are two aspects that of what goes wrong in the solidarity here. So this solidarity with my in-group, which is the in-group of ressentiment bearers towards somebody else, is negative in that sense that it is only based, it's not a solidarity based on some positive values that we have and share and vow and express and that are important to us, but if that's really the only thing that holds us together, ressentiment, this solidarity is based only on hostility towards an outgroup. And it is false, it's not false in the sense of being hostile, but it's false in the sense that it is all based on the illusion of our collective or collaboratively illusory self-deceptions. But you might wonder whether now isn't in the end, so I've asked why and tried to argue that ressentiment is moral psychologically but also psychodynamically and also functionally bad in the sense that you shouldn't, it's not rational to bear ressentiment. So, but you might now wonder, I mean, if all this positive reinforcement happens for the individuals, it might be at least rational to engage in it. Because the new social identity that I gain may be false, yes, may be illusory, but it is in some sense successful, it seems, psychodynamically, because it enhances individual self-respect and self-esteem, ultimately also self-esteem. However, I think, and one would need to discuss that more, of course, but ultimately this will not be the case, so it is still irrational in that sense now. It's not advisable for the subject to bear it, because it is based not just on an illusion, but it is ineffective and only a temporary relief. It is ineffective because although it is true that, and that's what I've said, the self-deceptive, the tension that we have in self-deception, in all kinds of self-deception, is partly stabilized and rationalized in the group context, but ultimately you have the same tendencies on the group level, and it will be just worse in a way. So the tensions will be just, they will manifest themselves and come to the fore and also make the whole process unstable, I would argue. And I'm coming just to the conclusion, so this is just really to frame it back again. So what is then wrong? Just wrong in the sense of moral, psychologically and psychodynamically, is precisely that it is based on self-deception, self-deceptive presentation of values, and also this process is unstable, and the same or similar goes for wrongness, as it were, in the sense of inappropriateness, also in the more normatively important sense and socially important sense. What's wrong with this mechanism and sentiment is that it is an illusion, again, of value feelings, and it is also in the collaborative context especially reinforced and just gets worse and leads to this false solidarity. Thanks a lot for your patience. It was exactly an hour, so I will set it up. Thanks a lot.